Two hunters stepped through frozen leaves in Michigan's Beards Hills State Game Area on a November morning in 1981. The air was sharp, silent, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Then they saw her, 21-year-old Natalie Lewis, lying in the woods, lifeless. What should have been an ordinary hunting trip became the discovery that would haunt St. Clair County for over 4 decades. No witnesses, no suspects, no answers. Just a young woman's life stolen in the shadows of those trees and a family left waiting in agony. Detectives worked the case hard. They followed every lead, interviewed dozens, collected evidence, but 1,981, technology had limits. The case went cold. 41 years passed. Then in 2023, a DNA breakthrough changed everything. Forensic genetic genealogy, the same science that's been cracking cold cases nationwide, finally revealed a name. And when investigators made the arrest, it sent shockwaves through Port Huron. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss how this case finally breaks wide open. This is the story of Natalie Lewis and the decades-long hunt for her killer. Quick question before we continue. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories reach, and it helps us understand who's part of this community seeking justice for victims like Natalie. To understand the tragedy of what happened in those woods, you need to know who Natalie Lewis was, because she wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a case number or a cold file gathering dust in some evidence room. She was 21 years old, full of life, full of dreams. Natalie grew up in Port Huron, Michigan, a blue-collar town sitting right on the border with Canada, where the St. Clair River flows into Lake Huron. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where neighbors look out for each other, where a young woman's murder doesn't just shake a family, it shakes an entire community. In 1981, Natalie was navigating that tricky space between adolescence and adulthood. She'd graduated high school a few years earlier, and like so many young people in Port Huron, she was figuring out what came next. Work, relationships, independence. The future stretched out before her with all its possibilities. Those who knew her described Natalie as friendly and outgoing. She had that kind of warmth that made people feel comfortable around her. She wasn't the type to cause trouble or get mixed up in dangerous situations. She was just a regular young woman trying to make her way in the world. She had family who loved her deeply, parents who'd raised her in Port Huron, siblings who shared childhood memories with her, friends who'd grown up alongside her in this tight-knit Michigan town. These were the people who would spend the next 41 years wondering what happened, wondering who took her from them, wondering if they'd ever get answers. In November of 1981, Natalie was living her life like any other 21-year-old. She had routines, places she went, people she saw. Clair County wasn't a big place. Port Huron had maybe around 33,000 residents back then. It was the kind of town where you'd run into familiar faces at the grocery store, at the gas station, at local hangouts. The early 80s in Michigan meant something specific. The auto industry was struggling, unemployment was climbing, but life went on. People still went to work, still socialized, still made plans for the future. Natalie was part of that fabric, a young woman carving out her place in a community that would soon be forever changed by her loss. What makes cases like this so devastating isn't just the violence, it's the interruption, the sudden, brutal end to a story that should have continued for decades. Natalie should have had the chance to build a career, to fall in love, to maybe start a family of her own, to grow old, to become someone's grandmother someday. Instead, her story was cut short in the worst possible way. Her family would never get to see what she might have become. They'd never share another holiday meal with her, never hear her laugh again, never get her advice or her comfort during hard times. Every birthday that passed without her was a reminder. Every Christmas, every family gathering where her absence screamed louder than any conversation. And for 41 years, they wouldn't even have the closure of knowing who did this to her. Think about that for a moment. 4 decades of questions, of wondering if the person who killed your daughter, your sister, your friend, was still out there walking around free, maybe living in the same town, maybe passing you on the street, maybe sitting next to you at a restaurant or a gas station, and you'd never know. That's the special kind of torture that comes with unsolved cases. Natalie's loved ones had to live with that uncertainty every single day. They had to watch as other cases got solved, as other families got answers, as technology improved and forensic science advanced, but still, nothing for Natalie. The file stayed cold. The evidence stayed locked away. The questions stayed unanswered. Port Huron remembered her, though. Small towns don't forget their own. Even as years turned into decades, people who'd known Natalie or known of her case carried that knowledge with them. It became part of the town's history, part of its collective memory. A dark chapter that never got a proper ending. Until 2023. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how investigators finally cracked this case after more than 4 decades, we need to go back to where it all started. Back to that cold November morning in 1981. Back to the Beards Hills State Game Area. Back to the moment when 2 hunters made a discovery that would launch one of Michigan's longest-running murder investigations. We need to go back to the day Natalie Lewis was found, because that's where the questions began. That's where the evidence was collected. That's where detectives started a hunt that wouldn't end for 41 years. And every detail from that scene, every piece of evidence carefully preserved, would eventually become the key to solving a case that seemed unsolvable. Natalie Lewis deserved better than what happened to her in those woods. She deserved to live a full life. But since that was stolen from her, the very least she deserved was justice. It just took 4 decades to get there. November in Michigan is unforgiving. The trees are bare, the ground is hard, the air cuts through your jacket and settles into your bones. It's hunting season, one of the few times of year when people venture deep into places like the Beards Hills State Game Area. This stretch of land in St. Clair County is remote, quiet. Miles of dense forest and rolling terrain where you can walk for hours without seeing another soul. It's the kind of place hunters seek out precisely because of its isolation. On this particular morning, 2 hunters were doing exactly that, moving through the woods, scanning for deer, listening for movement in the underbrush. They weren't expecting to find a body. The moment they saw her, everything stopped. The casual rhythm of their hunt shattered in an instant. This wasn't an animal. This was a person, a young woman, lying motionless among the fallen leaves and bare branches. They knew immediately something terrible had happened here. One of them stayed while the other went for help. In 1981, you couldn't just pull out a cell phone and dial 911. You had to find the nearest road, the nearest house, the nearest phone. Every minute felt like an hour. When law enforcement arrived, the scene confirmed their worst fears. Natalie Lewis, 21 years old, dead. The St. Clair County Sheriff's Department secured the area immediately. Yellow tape went up. Officers fanned out through the woods, searching for anything that might tell them what happened. Detectives were called in. The medical examiner was notified. This was now a homicide investigation. The location itself raised immediate questions. Beards Hills State Game Area wasn't exactly on the way to anywhere. You didn't end up there by accident. It was deliberate, remote, the kind of place someone might choose if they wanted privacy, if they wanted to make sure nobody would stumble across something or someone for a while. But the hunters had. And now the clock was ticking. Investigators documented everything, photographs from every angle, measurements, sketches of the scene. In 1981, crime scene investigation was meticulous, but limited by the technology of the time. No digital cameras, no GPS coordinates, no DNA databases. Just film cameras, notepads, and the trained eyes of experienced detectives. They collected what physical evidence they could find, anything that might have belonged to the killer, anything that seemed out of place in these woods. Every fiber, every trace, every potential clue was carefully bagged and labeled. The condition of Natalie's body told part of the story, but not all of it. The medical examiner would need to conduct an autopsy to determine exact cause of death, time of death, and whether there were any defensive wounds or other evidence that might point toward what happened in her final moments. But even standing there in those woods, detectives knew they were looking at something brutal, something violent. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't natural causes. Someone had killed this young woman and left her here. The questions came fast. Who was she? They'd need to identify her officially, notify next of kin, start building a timeline of her last known movements. When did this happen? Hours ago? Days? The cold November temperatures would affect decomposition, making it harder to pinpoint an exact time frame. How did she get here? Did she come willingly with someone she knew? Was she brought here against her will? Was this the murder scene? Or had she been killed elsewhere and dumped in these woods? And, most importantly, who did this? The hunters who found her were interviewed extensively. Had they seen anyone else in the area? Any vehicles on the access roads? Anything unusual in the days or weeks before? They became the first witnesses in a case that would eventually involve hundreds of interviews. As word spread through Port Huron that a body had been found in Beards Hills, fear crept into the community. People started locking doors that used to stay open. Parents kept closer watch on their kids. Women looked over their shoulders. Because if this could happen to Natalie Lewis, it could happen to anyone. And until they caught whoever did this, nobody was truly safe. The St. Clair County Sheriff's Department didn't waste time. Within hours of Natalie's body being discovered, detectives were knocking on doors, making phone calls, pulling together every piece of information they could find about the young woman whose life had been violently cut short. First priority, positive identification and notification of family. When Natalie's parents received the news, their world collapsed. No parent should ever have to hear those words. No family should ever have to identify their child's body at the medical examiner's office. But that's exactly what happened. And in that moment, their lives split into two distinct chapters, before Natalie's murder and after. The grief was immediate and overwhelming, but so were the questions. Who would do this? Why? What happened to her? Detectives needed answers to those same questions, and they needed them fast. The first 48 hours of any homicide investigation are critical. Memories are fresh. Evidence is still viable. Witnesses haven't had time to forget details or convince themselves they didn't see anything important. The trail is hot. Lead investigators started building a timeline. When was Natalie last seen alive? Where was she? Who was she with? What was she doing in the hours and days before she ended up in those woods? They interviewed family members first. When did they last speak to her? Did she mention any plans? Any new people in her life? Any problems or conflicts? Was she scared of anyone? Had she mentioned feeling threatened or uncomfortable around someone? Her friends were next. Young people, in their early 20s, often confide things to friends that they don't tell their parents. Maybe Natalie had mentioned meeting someone. Maybe she'd talked about going somewhere. Maybe there was a boyfriend, an ex, someone who'd been paying unwanted attention. Co-workers were interviewed. Neighbors, acquaintances, anyone who might have crossed paths with Natalie in the days before her death. Detectives cast a wide net, because at this stage, everyone was a potential witness. Everyone might know something, even if they didn't realize it was important. The autopsy results came back and provided crucial information. Cause of death, evidence of assault, approximate time of death based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and other factors the medical examiner could assess. Any trace evidence found on her body, fibers, hairs, anything that might have transferred from her attacker. This was 1,981. DNA analysis as we know it today didn't exist yet. The first DNA conviction wouldn't happen until 1987, so detectives were working with more traditional forensic methods: fingerprints, blood typing, fiber analysis, hair comparison under microscopes. They had evidence, they had samples, but the technology to fully exploit that evidence was still years away. Still, they worked with what they had. Investigators looked at Natalie's last known movements. Where had she been? Port Huron wasn't a huge city. Someone must have seen her. Maybe at a store, maybe at a gas station, maybe getting into a car with someone. They checked local businesses, showed her photo around. Did you see this woman? When? Was she alone? They looked at vehicles. Beards Hills State Game Area wasn't accessible by foot from town. Someone had to drive there. Did anyone see an unfamiliar car on the access roads around the time of the murder? Did hunters or other visitors to the area notice any vehicles parked in unusual spots? Potential suspects started emerging. In cases like this, investigators always look at the people closest to the victim first. Statistically, most murder victims know their killers. So they looked hard at boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, male friends, anyone who might have had romantic interest in Natalie. They administered polygraph tests to persons of interest. Some people passed. Some results were inconclusive. Some people refused to take them at all, which raised its own questions. They looked at anyone with a history of violence, anyone with a criminal record in St. Clair County, sex offenders, anyone who'd been accused of assault or harassment. This was a violent crime, which meant the person who did it likely had violence in them already. Tips started coming in from the community. Some were credible, some were based on rumors or suspicion, some were completely off base, but every single one had to be followed up. Every lead had to be chased down, no matter how thin. Detectives worked around the clock. This wasn't just another case to them. This was a young woman from their community. This was someone's daughter, and whoever killed her was still out there. The pressure was immense. The media was covering the story. The community was terrified. Natalie's family was desperate for answers, and the sheriff's department knew that with each passing day, the chances of solving this case decreased. They recanvassed the area around Beards Hills, knocked on doors of houses within miles of where the body was found. Did you see anything unusual? Hear anything? Notice any strangers in the area? They looked at similar cases. Had there been other attacks on young women in Michigan, in neighboring states? Could this be connected to other unsolved crimes? They brought in experts, forensic specialists, behavioral analysts who could create a profile of the type of person who might commit this kind of crime. But despite all the effort, despite the hundreds of hours of work, the countless interviews, the careful analysis of every piece of evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. They had theories, they had persons of interest, they had evidence that might someday prove crucial. But they didn't have enough to charge anyone. They didn't have that one piece of concrete proof that would hold up in court and put a killer behind bars. Weeks turned into months. The initial surge of tips and leads began to slow. The media attention faded. Other cases demanded the department's resources. And slowly, painfully, inevitably, Natalie Lewis's case began to go cold. Not because detectives didn't care, not because they gave up, but because they'd exhausted every lead they had with the tools available to them in 1981. The file stayed open, the evidence stayed preserved, and investigators held on to hope that someday, somehow, something would break. They just didn't know it would take 41 years. There's a special kind of pain that comes with unsolved cases. It's not the sharp, immediate agony of loss, though that's there too. It's the slow, grinding ache of questions that never get answered, of birthdays and holidays where someone's absence feels heavier each year, of watching other families get closure while yours remains trapped in an endless loop of wondering. For Natalie Lewis's family, that pain lasted 41 years. Imagine that, 41 years of not knowing, 41 years of looking at strangers and wondering, could that be the person who killed her? 41 years of hoping the phone would ring with news from the sheriff's department. 41 years of watching crime shows and reading about forensic breakthroughs and thinking, maybe this will be the thing that solves Natalie's case. But year after year, nothing changed. The case file sat in the St. Clair County Sheriff's Department. Evidence remained in storage, carefully preserved, properly catalogued, waiting for the day when technology might catch up to justice. Detectives who'd worked the original investigation retired. New investigators came in, read through the file, tried to find something their predecessors might have missed. But the case stayed cold. In the 1,980 seconds, other cases in Michigan got solved, arrests were made, trials were held, families got answers. But not Natalie's family. They watched from the sidelines as the justice system worked for others while their daughter's killer remained free. The 1,990 seconds brought new forensic techniques. DNA analysis became a real tool for law enforcement. Cases that had been unsolved for years suddenly cracked wide open because of genetic evidence. The Innocence Project started using DNA to exonerate people who'd been wrongfully convicted. The technology was revolutionary. Detectives looked at Natalie's case again. They had biological evidence from 1,981. Could it be tested now? Could DNA finally give them the answer they'd been searching for? They tried. They submitted evidence for analysis, but the results weren't conclusive enough to identify a suspect. The samples were old. The technology, while advanced compared to 1,981, still had limitations. They got a DNA profile, but without a match in the system, it was just data. Just numbers and letters that didn't point to a name. Still, it was something. It was a profile they could compare against suspects, if they ever developed new leads. It was a piece of the puzzle, even if they couldn't see the full picture yet. The 2000s arrived. Natalie had been gone for 2 decades. Her parents were older now. Her siblings had built lives, had families of their own. But the hole Natalie left never filled in. It couldn't. You don't just move on from something like this. Every Thanksgiving, they remembered that November morning in 1981. Every time they drove past Beard's Hills, they thought about what happened in those woods. Every time they saw a young woman around the age Natalie was when she died, they thought about all the years their daughter never got to live. Port Huron changed over the decades. New businesses opened, old ones closed. People moved away, new families moved in. But longtime residents still remembered Natalie Lewis, still remembered when a young woman's murder shook their community, and the killer was never caught. Some cases become part of a town's identity. They become the story people tell when they talk about their hometown's dark history. Natalie's case was one of those. It represented something unfinished, something unresolved, a wound that never quite healed. Detectives continued to periodically review the file. Cold case units became more common in law enforcement agencies across the country. The idea was simple: dedicate resources specifically to unsolved cases. Bring fresh eyes to old evidence. Use new technology to re-examine what previous generations of investigators had collected. St. Clair County wasn't a massive department with unlimited resources, but they didn't forget about Natalie. Every few years, someone would pull her file, read through the witness statements, look at the evidence inventory, check if there were any new forensic techniques that might apply. But nothing broke the case open. The 2010 seconds brought even more advances. Familial DNA searching became a tool, the idea that even if a suspect's DNA wasn't in the system, maybe a relative's was. Law enforcement could search databases for partial matches, then build family trees to identify potential suspects. It was promising, but it required the right circumstances, the right evidence, the right databases. And even then, it was labor-intensive work that required specialized expertise. Meanwhile, Natalie's family kept waiting. Her parents aged. The grief didn't lessen, it just changed shape. It became something they carried with them every day, a weight so familiar they almost forgot what life felt like without it. Almost. They attended support groups for families of murder victims. They connected with other people who understood what it meant to live in limbo, to have a loved one's case unsolved, to wonder if justice would ever come, or if the person responsible would die before ever being held accountable. That was a real fear. As decades passed, the likelihood increased that whoever killed Natalie might die before being identified, might escape earthly justice entirely. The thought was unbearable. But what could they do except wait? Except hope? Except trust that somewhere, somehow, someone was still working on Natalie's case? Other high-profile cold cases started getting solved in the late 2010 seconds. The Golden State Killer was identified and arrested in 2018 after decades of terror and mystery. Investigators had used a relatively new technique: forensic genetic genealogy. They'd uploaded crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, found distant relatives, built family trees, and narrowed down suspects until they found their man. It was a game changer. Suddenly, cases that seemed permanently unsolved were cracking open. The Bear Brook murders, the Christy Mirac case, the April Tinsley case. One by one, cold cases that had haunted communities for decades were finally getting answers. Families who'd waited 30, 40, even 50 years were finally learning the truth about what happened to their loved ones. And investigators across the country started looking at their own cold cases with renewed hope. If genetic genealogy could solve those cases, what else could it solve? In St. Clair County, detectives started thinking about Natalie Lewis again. They had DNA evidence from 1,981. They had a profile. What if they could use this new technique? What if, after all these years, forensic genetic genealogy could finally give Natalie's family the answers they deserved? It was worth a shot. After 40 years, it was absolutely worth a shot. The decision was made. They would pursue genetic genealogy. They would send Natalie's case to experts who specialized in this cutting-edge forensic technique. They would do everything possible to finally identify who killed her in those woods back in 1981. Natalie's family was notified. After decades of disappointment, they were cautious about getting their hopes up. They'd been down this road before. New techniques, new possibilities, new hope that ultimately led nowhere. But this felt different. The success rate of forensic genetic genealogy was undeniable. Cases were being solved, killers were being identified and arrested. Maybe, just maybe, it was finally Natalie's turn. The evidence was submitted. The analysis began. And once again, Natalie's family found themselves waiting. But this time, the wait would actually lead somewhere. This time, after 41 years, they were about to get answers. If you're feeling the weight of this story, smash that like button. Cases like this need attention, and your support helps us bring these stories to light. Real quick, what time is it where you are right now? Morning coffee and true crime? Afternoon break? Late night deep dive into unsolved mysteries? Let me know below. I'm always curious when people tune into these stories and how they fit into your day. To understand how Natalie's case finally got solved, you need to understand the science that made it possible. Forensic genetic genealogy sounds complicated, and in practice, it is. But the basic concept is surprisingly straightforward. Traditional DNA analysis works like this. Investigators take DNA from a crime scene, create a profile, and compare it against databases like CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System that contains profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees. If there's a match, you've got your suspect. But what happens when there's no match? What happens when your suspect has never been arrested, never had their DNA entered into law enforcement databases? For decades, that's where investigations hit a wall. Forensic genetic genealogy changed everything. Instead of just looking for exact matches in law enforcement databases, investigators started using public genealogy databases, the same ones regular people use to find distant cousins and build family trees. Websites where people voluntarily upload their DNA results to discover their ancestry and connect with relatives. Here's how it works. Investigators take crime scene DNA and upload it to these public databases. They're not looking for an exact match anymore. They're looking for partial matches, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share enough DNA to indicate they're related to the suspect, even distantly. Once they find these relatives, genetic genealogists get to work. They build family trees. They trace lineages backward to common ancestors, then forward through different branches. They cross-reference with historical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, census data. Slowly, methodically, they narrow down the possibilities. They eliminate branches that don't fit. They focus on branches that do. They look at who was living in the right geographic area at the time of the crime, who was the right age, who had the right characteristics. Eventually, they arrive at a name. Sometimes, a few names. Potential suspects who fit the genetic profile and the circumstantial evidence. Then law enforcement takes over. They investigate these individuals. They look for connections to the victim or the crime scene. And if everything lines up, they find a way to collect a direct DNA sample, maybe from trash, maybe from a discarded cup or cigarette, to confirm the match. It's painstaking work. It can take months, but it works. The Golden State Killer case in 2018 proved that. Joseph DeAngelo had terrorized California for years in the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds, murders, rapes, burglaries, and then seemingly vanished. For decades, investigators had his DNA but no match. Then they used genetic genealogy, built a family tree, and identified him. He was arrested at age 72, living a quiet suburban life, and eventually pleaded guilty to 13 murders. That case opened the floodgates. Suddenly, law enforcement agencies across the country realized they had a new tool. Cold cases that had seemed unsolvable were suddenly viable again. By the early 2020s, forensic genetic genealogy had solved hundreds of cases. Murders from the 1,970 seconds, 80 seconds, 90 seconds, cases where the killer had evaded justice for decades were finally being cracked. And that's when St. Clair County investigators decided it was time to take another look at Natalie Lewis. They had good DNA evidence from the 1,981 crime scene. It had been properly preserved. They had a profile. What they didn't have was a match in traditional databases. But maybe, just maybe, genetic genealogy could change that. The decision was made to partner with experts who specialized in this technique. The DNA evidence was sent off for analysis and uploading to genealogy databases. Then came the waiting game. Genetic genealogists started searching for matches, looking for people who shared DNA with whoever killed Natalie, building trees, tracing lineages, eliminating possibilities, narrowing focus. This wasn't a quick process. Unlike TV crime shows where DNA results come back in hours, real forensic genetic genealogy takes time, weeks, sometimes months. It requires meticulous research, careful analysis, and collaboration between scientists and investigators. But progress was being made. Distant relatives were identified. Family trees were constructed. Branches were traced forward through generations. Names started emerging, people who were related to the unknown suspect, even if they didn't know it themselves. Investigators cross-referenced these names with their original case files. Were any of these family lines connected to Port Huron in 1981? Did any of them have members who would have been the right age, the right gender, in the right location? The circle was tightening. And then, after months of work, the genealogists had something concrete. They'd narrowed it down. They had a name, a person who fit the genetic profile, who had connections to the area, who could have been in St. Clair County in November 1981. Investigators now had their suspect. After 41 years, they finally knew who killed Natalie Lewis. Now, they just had to prove it. The call came in 2023. After months of genetic genealogy work, after countless hours of building family trees and tracing lineages, after eliminating dozens of potential branches, the team had a name. For the detectives at the St. Clair County Sheriff's Department, this was the moment they'd been waiting for. Some of them had worked this case for years. Others had inherited it from retired investigators who'd never stopped thinking about Natalie Lewis. And now, finally, they had a suspect. But having a name wasn't enough. They needed to be absolutely certain. They needed to verify. They needed evidence that would hold up in court and convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The genetic genealogy had pointed them to a specific individual, someone whose DNA profile matched the crime scene evidence when traced through distant relatives, someone who had connections to Michigan, someone who would have been in the area in 1981. Investigators immediately began digging into this person's background. Where were they living in November 1981? The answer, Michigan. Close enough to St. Clair County to have access to Beards Hills State Game Area. How old were they at the time? The right age range to match the profile investigators had developed over the years. Did they have any connection to Natalie Lewis? This was crucial. Had they known her? Crossed paths with her? Lived in the same area? Worked in the same places? Run in the same social circles? Investigators pulled records from 1981, employment records, residential addresses, vehicle registrations, anything that could place this person in Port Huron or the surrounding area when Natalie was killed. They interviewed people who'd known the suspect back then, old friends, former co-workers, neighbors. Do you remember this person? What were they like in 1981? Did they ever mention knowing Natalie Lewis? They looked at the suspect's history. Had they been in trouble with the law? Were there other incidents of violence? Other accusations? Other victims? The picture was coming together. And it wasn't good. This wasn't some random stranger who'd passed through Michigan once and disappeared. This was someone who'd been part of the community, someone who'd lived there, someone who potentially had regular contact with people in Port Huron, someone who'd been hiding in plain sight for 41 years. But investigators still needed direct DNA confirmation. The genetic genealogy had pointed them in the right direction, but to make an arrest that would stick, they needed a direct sample from the suspect to compare against the 1981 crime scene evidence. This is where surveillance came in. Detectives began watching the suspect, carefully, quietly, waiting for an opportunity to collect discarded DNA. A coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a napkin, anything the suspect touched and threw away that could legally be collected and tested. This is standard procedure in genetic genealogy cases. You can't just walk up to someone and demand a DNA sample without probable cause. But if someone throws something away in public, it's fair game. The surveillance team got what they needed. The suspect's discarded item was collected, carefully preserved, and sent to the lab for analysis. Now came another waiting period, shorter this time, but no less tense. Would the direct DNA sample match the crime scene evidence from 1981? Days passed. The lab worked. Detectives waited. And then the results came back. Match. It was him. The DNA from the suspect's discarded item matched the DNA from Natalie Lewis's murder scene. Not a partial match, not a familial match, a direct, definitive match. After 41 years, they had their killer. The evidence was solid. The science was sound. The chain of custody was intact. Everything they needed to make an arrest and pursue prosecution was in place. Investigators notified the prosecutor's office. Legal teams reviewed the evidence. Warrants were prepared. An arrest strategy was developed. And then came one of the hardest calls detectives ever have to make, but also one of the most important. They contacted Natalie's family. Imagine receiving that phone call after 4 decades, after years of hoping and waiting and wondering if this day would ever come, after watching other families get closure while yours remained in limbo, after starting to accept that maybe you'd never know who killed your daughter, your sister, your loved one. And then the phone rings. We've identified the person who killed Natalie. We have DNA evidence. We're preparing to make an arrest. The emotions must have been overwhelming. Relief, vindication, grief all over again. Anger that it took so long. Gratitude that it finally happened. Disbelief that after all these years, they were actually getting answers. Natalie's family had questions. Of course they did. Who was it? Did Natalie know this person? Why did he kill her? What happened that night? Some of those questions could be answered. Some couldn't. Some might never be fully answered. But at least now they knew who. At least now there would be accountability. At least now the person who'd stolen Natalie from them would face justice. The family was asked to keep the information confidential for a short time while final preparations were made. They agreed. After waiting 41 years, they could wait a few more days. Behind the scenes, law enforcement was coordinating. The arrest needed to be executed carefully, safely, with enough personnel to handle any situation that might arise. Because here's the thing. They were about to arrest someone for a murder committed in 1981, someone who'd been living free for over 4 decades, someone who might have thought they'd gotten away with it, someone who might not go quietly. Everything had to be planned perfectly. The date was set, the team was assembled, the warrants were signed, and in 2023, 41 years after Natalie Lewis was found murdered in the woods of Beards Hills State Game Area, law enforcement was finally ready to bring her killer to justice. The arrest was about to shock an entire community. The arrest happened swiftly and decisively. In 2023, more than 4 decades after Natalie Lewis's murder, law enforcement officers moved in on their suspect. The planning had been meticulous. The evidence was ironclad. The moment had finally arrived. For operational security reasons, the exact details of the arrest, the precise location, the specific tactics used weren't immediately released to the public. But what mattered was this. The suspect was taken into custody without incident. After 41 years of freedom, Natalie's killer was finally in handcuffs. The suspect was transported to the St. Clair County Jail, booked, processed, formally charged with murder. The wheels of justice that had been stalled for over 4 decades were finally turning. And then the news broke. The St. Clair County Sheriff's Department held a press conference. Media from across Michigan gathered. Reporters who'd covered cold cases. Journalists who remembered when Natalie's murder first happened. News outlets eager to report on a breakthrough that had taken more than 40 years to achieve. The announcement was straightforward. An arrest had been made in the 1981 murder of Natalie Lewis. DNA evidence, specifically forensic genetic genealogy, had identified the suspect. Charges had been filed. The suspect's name was released to the public. And that's when the real shock hit Port Huron. Because this wasn't some drifter who'd passed through town in 1981 and disappeared. This wasn't a stranger from another state, with no ties to the community. This was someone local, someone who'd been part of the fabric of St. Clair County, someone who'd lived among them, either back in 1981 or in the years since. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. People who'd known the suspect couldn't believe it. Him? No way. He seemed so normal. That's what neighbors said, what former co-workers said, what people who'd crossed paths with him over the years said. But that's often how it goes with cases like this. Killers don't always look like monsters. They don't wear signs announcing their crimes. They blend in. They live ordinary lives. They go to work, pay their bills, interact with neighbors, and carry their secrets in silence. For 41 years, this person had done exactly that. Had he thought about Natalie over the decades? Had he followed the investigation? Had he worried every time forensic science advanced that his day of reckoning was coming? Or had he convinced himself he'd gotten away with it, that enough time had passed that he was safe? We may never know what went through his mind during those 4 decades, but we know what happened when investigators finally caught up with him. Social media exploded with reactions. People from Port Huron shared their disbelief. Others expressed relief that the case was finally solved. Some shared memories of Natalie, of how her murder had affected the community, of how they'd never forgotten her. Natalie's family released a statement through the sheriff's department. They thanked investigators for never giving up. They thanked the forensic genealogists who'd worked tirelessly to identify the suspect. They expressed gratitude that after all these years, they finally had answers. But they also made clear that this wasn't a happy ending. Nothing could bring Natalie back. Nothing could give them back the 41 years they'd spent wondering and waiting. Nothing could erase the pain of her loss. This was justice, but it was bittersweet justice. The legal process began moving forward. The suspect was arraigned. Bail was addressed in cases like this, involving decades-old murders and DNA evidence. Suspects are often held without bond or given extremely high bail amounts. The risk of flight is too great. A preliminary examination was scheduled. Discovery would be exchanged. The prosecution would present their evidence. The defense would mount their case. This was going to trial. Media coverage intensified. True crime podcasts picked up the story. News outlets across Michigan and beyond reported on the breakthrough. The case became a national example of how forensic genetic genealogy was solving cold cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. Other families with unsolved cases watched closely. If Natalie's case could be solved after 41 years, maybe theirs could too. Maybe there was hope. Maybe advances in science would finally bring them the answers they'd been desperately seeking. Law enforcement agencies across the country took notice as well. The success in Natalie's case reinforced what many departments were already learning. It's worth revisiting cold cases with genetic genealogy. It's worth preserving evidence carefully. It's worth never giving up, because technology keeps advancing, and what's impossible today might be routine tomorrow. For the investigators who'd worked Natalie's case over the years, some retired, some still active, this arrest was deeply personal. They'd carried this case with them. They'd thought about Natalie. They'd promised her family they wouldn't forget, and they'd kept that promise. The arrest didn't erase the 41 years of frustration. It didn't make up for the decades Natalie's family spent without answers. But it proved something important. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it just takes time. Sometimes it takes new technology. Sometimes it takes investigators who refuse to let a case go cold in their hearts, even when the trail goes cold on paper. Natalie Lewis had been waiting 41 years for this moment. Her family had been waiting 41 years for this moment. And now, finally, the person who'd taken her life was going to be held accountable. This is why cases like Natalie's matter. If you want to see more unsolved mysteries brought to justice, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. Before we wrap up, what's the weather like where you are right now? Sunny? Raining? Snowing? Cold and grey? I'm always curious about the different environments people are in when they're diving into these stories. Drop it in the comments below. With the suspect in custody and charges filed, the legal proceedings moved forward through the Michigan court system. The prosecution's case was built on solid ground. DNA evidence linking the suspect directly to the 1981 crime scene, forensic genetic genealogy that had identified him through family connections, a direct DNA sample that confirmed the match. This wasn't circumstantial evidence or witness testimony that could be challenged. This was science. The defense had limited options. When DNA evidence is this strong, defense attorneys typically focus on procedural issues. Was the evidence collected properly? Was the chain of custody maintained? Were the defendant's rights violated at any point? Was the genetic genealogy process legally sound? These are important questions in any criminal case. Everyone deserves a vigorous defense. Everyone deserves due process. But the reality was clear. The evidence against the suspect was overwhelming. As the case progressed, more details emerged about what investigators believed happened in November 1981. The exact motive may never be fully known. Did the suspect know Natalie personally? Was this a random encounter that turned violent? Was there a relationship or connection that investigators uncovered? Some of these details were revealed in court filings and hearings. Others remained sealed or were held back for trial. What was clear was that this was a violent crime. Natalie's life was taken brutally, and the person responsible had walked free for over 4 decades while her family suffered. One of the haunting questions that emerged: were there other victims? When someone commits a murder and gets away with it, there's always the possibility they did it again. Investigators began looking at other unsolved cases from the 1982 and beyond. Were there similar crimes in Michigan or other states where the suspect had lived? Were there other young women who'd been attacked or killed in ways that matched Natalie's case? This is standard procedure when a cold case finally breaks. You look at the suspect's entire timeline, you check for patterns, you see if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger series of crimes. As of the information available, no other cases have been definitively linked to Natalie's killer. But investigations like this take time. Evidence from other cold cases might be re-examined. DNA might be compared. The full scope of this person's actions may not be known for months or even years. The arrest also had broader implications for cold case investigations across Michigan and beyond. St. Clair County's success with forensic genetic genealogy demonstrated what's possible when law enforcement embraces new technology. Other departments took notice. Other cold cases were pulled from storage. Other families who'd been waiting decades for answers suddenly had renewed hope. The Michigan State Police and other agencies began reviewing their unsolved homicides with fresh eyes. Which cases had preserved DNA evidence? Which ones might be candidates for genetic genealogy? How many families could finally get the closure they deserved? This is one of the most important legacies of cases like Natalie's. They don't just solve one murder. They open doors for solving many murders. They prove that cold cases can be cracked. They show that advances in science can reach back through decades and deliver justice. But questions remain. Why did it take 41 years? Could this case have been solved sooner if genetic genealogy had been available earlier? The answer is yes, but that's not anyone's fault. Science advances at its own pace. Investigators worked with the tools they had at the time. What could have been done differently in 1981? Probably nothing. The original investigators did solid work. They collected evidence properly. They preserved it carefully. They followed leads diligently. They just didn't have the technology to identify a suspect from DNA alone. Will the suspect ever explain why he killed Natalie? Maybe. Some defendants eventually confess or provide statements. Others never admit guilt, even when the evidence is overwhelming. Time will tell whether Natalie's family will ever get a full explanation of what happened that November day in 1981. For now, what matters is this. After 41 years, there's accountability. After 41 years, there's justice. After 41 years, Natalie Lewis's case is no longer unsolved. And that means everything. Natalie Lewis was 21 years old when her life was stolen from her. She never got to turn 22, never got to experience her 30s, her 40s, her 50s, never got to build the life she should have had, never got to chase her dreams or discover who she might have become. But her story didn't end in those woods in 1981. For 41 years, Natalie's case represented something important to her community and to law enforcement. It represented a promise. We will not forget you. We will not stop looking. We will not let your killer escape justice forever. And that promise was kept. Her family wants people to remember Natalie not just as a victim, but as a person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone who mattered, someone who was loved. someone whose absence left a hole that could never be filled. They want people to know that behind every cold case is a real human being. Someone who had hopes and fears and dreams, someone who deserved to live a full life, someone whose family has spent years, sometimes decades, waiting for answers. Natalie's case also helped advance the cause of justice in ways that extend far beyond St. Clair County. Her case became an example of what's possible when law enforcement refuses to give up, when evidence is preserved properly, when new technology is embraced, when investigators are willing to revisit old cases with fresh tools and fresh perspectives. The forensic genetic genealogy that solved Natalie's murder is now being used across the country to crack cold cases that once seemed hopeless. Families who'd resigned themselves to never getting answers are suddenly getting phone calls from detectives saying, "We've identified a suspect." That's Natalie's legacy. Her case helped pave the way for others to be solved. It also serves as a reminder that justice doesn't have a statute of limitations. You can't commit murder and simply wait it out. You can't assume that because years or decades have passed, you're safe. Science keeps advancing, investigators keep working, and eventually, the truth comes out. For other families still waiting for answers about their own loved ones, Natalie's case offers hope. If her case could be solved after 41 years, maybe theirs can too. Maybe the evidence sitting in storage will someday be the key to identifying a killer. Maybe advances in technology that don't even exist yet will crack cases that seem impossible today. Natalie deserved better than what happened to her in November 1981. She deserved to live. She deserved to grow old. She deserved all the experiences and opportunities that were stolen from her. But since that was taken away, the very least she deserved was justice. And after 41 years, she got it. Her family can finally have some measure of peace. Not closure. You never really get closure from something like this. But peace in knowing that the person who killed their daughter, their sister, their loved one, is finally being held accountable. That's what Natalie's legacy is. Justice delayed, but not denied. 41 years. That's how long Natalie Lewis's family waited for answers, how long investigators kept her case file open, how long evidence sat preserved in storage, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. 41 years of wondering, of hoping, of refusing to give up. And in 2023, that persistence finally paid off. Natalie's story matters because it reminds us that every unsolved case represents a real person, a real family, real pain that doesn't fade just because time passes. These aren't just statistics or file numbers. They're human beings who deserved better, and they deserve to have their stories told. If Natalie's story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. These stories need to be told, and your engagement helps make sure they reach the people who need to hear them. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What struck you most about this case? Do you know of other cold cases that deserve attention? Let's keep the conversation going. Cases like Natalie's prove that it's never too late for justice, that advances in science can reach back through decades, that families who've been waiting for answers might finally get them. 41 years is a long time to wait, but Natalie's family never stopped hoping. Investigators never stopped working, and eventually, the truth came out. That matters. Justice for Natalie Lewis came late, but it came, and that's something worth remembering. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.